Northern Italy, June 9, 1944. 1,400 hours. Oberleutnant Hans Muller of JG-53 observed the familiar twin boom shapes of American P-38 Lightnings approaching from the south. They escorted a formation of B-17 flying fortresses targeting the oil refineries at Pest. What Muller did not know was that tomorrow would mark the end of the Luftwaffe's most reliable escape tactic against Gabel Schwann's P-38s beneath his oxygen mask. Muller smiled, aware that these fork-tailed fighters had a critical flaw. Since late 1942, when the first P-38s appeared over North Africa, Luftwaffe pilots had learned that the Lightning could not safely follow a high-speed dive beyond 420 miles per hour without losing control. This knowledge had saved countless lives, turning what should have been fatal encounters into routine escapes. Muller himself had successfully used this tactic 17 times over the past 18 months. Watching pursuing P-38s pull up helplessly as he dove at speeds they could not match, the compressibility problem affecting the P-38 had become well known among Luftwaffe units. New pilots were trained specifically to exploit it, with veteran instructors demonstrating the exact angles and speeds required to force a pursuing Lightning to break off or risk losing control. Major Wilhelm Steinmann, commander of 2 Gruppe JG-53, had even published a tactical manual for Italian units, noting that the Lightning would experience violent tailshake around 515 kilometers per hour indicated airspeed, followed by an uncontrollable nose-down pitch. This technical weakness gave numerically inferior Luftwaffe units in Italy a psychological edge, knowing they had a reliable escape route whenever a P-38 appeared. The Italian Regia Aeronautica had verified this phenomenon firsthand. Lieutenant Colonel Angelo Tundi, chief test pilot, flew a captured P-38G from Guidonia Airfield on August 11, 1943. Attempting to intercept returning American bombers. Using the Lightning's profile to approach a B-24 formation unnoticed, he initiated a high-speed dive from 23,000 feet. The aircraft became uncontrollable at Mach 0.68, forcing him to abandon the attack and struggle to regain control as the elevators locked and the nose pitched violently down. Tundi reported to German technical intelligence that the P-38 was excellent in level flight but dangerous in high-speed dives, confirming Luftwaffe reports over the past year. German engineers at the Luftwaffe Test Center in Rechlin had analyzed captured P-38 documents. They concluded that the twin-boom design created a venturi effect between the central nacelle and engine booms, accelerating airflow to transonic speeds in relatively shallow dives and forming shock waves over the upper wing surface. These shock waves shifted the center of pressure rearward, producing a strong nose-down pitching moment that overpowered the elevators. The aircraft was essentially locked into a steepening dive until reaching denser air or exceeding structural limits. Analysis completed in February 1944 by Dr. Friedrich Müller at the Deutsche Versuchsanstalt für Luftfahrt determined that the P-38 could not safely exceed Mach 0.65 in a dive. This gave Messerschmitt Bf 109G and Focke-Wulf FW-190 pilots a significant tactical advantage when evading pursuers. Japanese naval pilots in the Solomon Islands had independently discovered the same weakness in 1943. Lieutenant Commander Shagaru Fukudome of the 204th Kokutai reported that American Lightning pilots would consistently break off when Japanese fighters initiated steep dives from altitude. Report intercepted and decoded by American intelligence, though dismissed as propaganda, accurately described how Zero pilots could evade seemingly superior P-38s by performing a split-is maneuver and diving at angles over 45. This forced the heavier American fighters to either abandon the chase or risk entering the dangerous compressibility regime. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto personally reviewed these reports in April 1943, just days before his fatal encounter with P-38s over Bougainville, noting that the Lightning's high-altitude performance advantage was negated by its inability to follow diving aircraft. The psychological impact of this technical limitation went beyond individual dogfights, shaping tactical doctrines and mission planning on both sides. American P-38 pilots flying from Foe and Amendola bases in southern Italy reported growing frustration with their inability to chase German fighters that routinely escaped by diving. This led to declining morale among the three Lightning groups of the 15th Air Force. Captain James Austin of the 82nd Fighter Group wrote in his combat diary on May 15, 1944, that watching enemy fighters escape with impunity felt like fighting with one hand tied behind his back. His squadron mate, Lieutenant William Capron, described the sickening feeling of helplessness when his P-38J began buffeting violently at 400 miles per hour during a pursuit dive. The issue became so severe that some pilots refused to chase diving enemies at all, knowing it could endanger both the pursuit and their own aircraft. By early June 1944, the Luftwaffe's exploitation of P-38 compressibility had reached its peak. German pilots treated encounters with Lightnings as opportunities to train younger pilots in escape tactics, rather than as genuine combat threats. Feldwebel Kurt Bühligen, who would later score 17 P-38 victories, recalled that attacking Lightning formations almost felt like sport. The Americans could not pursue effectively, allowing Germans to make single passes and dive away safely. This tactical advantage appeared clearly in loss statistics. The P-38 suffered the highest loss rates of any American fighter in the Mediterranean theater. Despite its powerful armament and theoretical performance benefits, the technical aspects of compressibility were well understood by Lockheed engineers in Burbank, California. Clarence Kelly Johnson had wrestled with the problem since early 1941, when test pilot Major Sine Gilkey first reported loss of control during a high-speed dive from 30,000 feet. Johnson later admitted the issue gave him an ulcer, recognizing that the twin-boom design created an aerodynamic problem absent in conventional single-engine fighters, and that resolving it would require entirely new approaches to high-speed flight. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics initially refused to test P-38 models in their high-speed wind tunnels, fearing damage to costly equipment. Only direct intervention by General Henry Hap Arnold forced the tests that revealed the problem's exact nature. By June 1944, over 10,000 Lightnings had been built, but fewer than 200 had received the critical modification to correct compressibility, and these remained in the United States or were being installed far from combat zones. Most P-38's flying missions in Europe and the Mediterranean operated under strict warnings not to exceed 420 miles per hour indicated. Airspeed in dive is a limitation German intelligence had learned from captured documents and radio intercepts. The restriction was even painted on instrument panels throughout the 8th and 15th Air Forces, serving as a constant reminder of the aircraft's potentially fatal weakness. The morning of June 10, 1944, marked an unexpected turning point. 96 P-38J Lightnings of the 1st and 82nd Fighter Groups prepared to launch from southern Italy for what would become a pivotal mission in the evolution of American fighter tactics. Unknown to German intelligence, several of these aircraft had been quietly modified with an experimental device. Lockheed called dive recovery flaps small surfaces on the wing undersides, designed to change pressure distribution and restore elevator control during high-speed dives. These modifications were carried out in secret at FOA's maintenance depot using kits assembled from spare parts. After the original shipment of 200 factory kits had been destroyed when a Royal Air Force fighter mistakenly shot down a Douglas, C-54 transport carrying them to England in March. 1944. Meanwhile, the morning briefing at JG-53's forward base at Wells prepared the Luftwaffe pilots for the day ahead. Operations began with routine confidence as Hauptmann Friedrich Blazer briefed his pilots on intercepting the anticipated American bomber stream targeting the Pest oil refineries. He emphasized that any P-38 Lightning escorts could still be evaded, using the standard diving escape tactic that had served them well for the past 18 months. The German pilots, many veterans with dozens of missions against American heavy bombers and their escorts, listened with casual confidence, fully aware of their enemy's weaknesses. They were unaware, however, that several P-38 J-25 LLO models in the approaching formation were equipped with electrically actuated dive recovery flaps, an innovation that would fundamentally change high-altitude combat. These flaps, located just outboard of the engine nacelles on the lower centerline of the wings, had been extensively tested by Lockheed pilot Tony Levier during morale tours of P-38 bases in England and Italy. Though many combat pilots remained skeptical of their practical utility, Kelly Johnson and his team at Lockheed had developed a solution that was simple yet revolutionary. The flaps extended downward 35 in 1.5 seconds when activated from the cockpit, disrupting airflow and preventing the shock waves over the wing's upper surface. This maintained the center of pressure, allowing the elevators to retain authority even as the aircraft approached Mach 0.75, well beyond the previous limit of Mach 0.65 that had restricted P-38 divees. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Jenkins, leading the 1st Fighter Group's 48 Lightnings toward Pest, personally oversaw the installation of dive flaps on 12 aircraft. His team worked overnight to position the flaps precisely along the wing cords, powered by the main electrical system and controlled via a guarded switch near the pilot's left hand. Jenkins test flew each modified plane from 25,000 feet, confirming that the flaps deployed correctly and restored control at speeds that would previously have caused total loss of control. At 0900 hours, German radar at Neja detected the approaching formation, 96 P-38s, escorting their bombers across the Adriatic toward the Romanian oil fields. The flight path suggested a routine escort mission. Luftwaffe controllers dispatched 3 groups of fighters, including elements from JG-53, GG-77, and the Romanian Air Force's Group 6 Vanter to intercept. Confident that their hit-and-run tactics would succeed, the German pilots climbed to 28,000 feet, positioning themselves upsun from the Americans, ready for the diving attacks that had worked reliably in previous encounters. At 0947, Oberleutnant Mueller led a squadron of 4 Bf-109G6 fighters in a classic bounce attack on the trailing elements of the 82nd Fighter Group, diving from 2,000 feet above. He achieved complete tactical surprise, opening fire on a P-38J flown by 2nd Lieutenant Harold Fisher. The American fighter burst into flames and spiraled toward the Danube Valley, while Mueller immediately initiated his escape dive at a 40 angle. Confident that any P-38 pursuing him would soon break off, what happened next defied all Luftwaffe expectations. Captain Robin Olds, flying P-38 J-15 Lou Scat, 3 of the 434th Fighter Squadron, witnessed Fisher's destruction and immediately rolled inverted to pursue Mueller. He reached for the guarded switch, activating his dive recovery flaps for the first time in combat. The flaps deployed with a subtle thump. The violent buffeting that normally began at 400 miles per hour did not occur. Airspeed climbed past 450, approaching 500 miles per hour, while Olds maintained full control and closed on Mueller's diving Bf-109. Mueller repeatedly checked his mirrors in disbelief. The American fighter not only followed but gained on him. The psychological impact on the German formation was immense. Radio transmissions captured by American intelligence revealed confusion and near panic among Luftwaffe pilots, who could not comprehend why their standard escape tactic had failed. Feldwebel Hans Dortmund, Muller's wingman, later reported that witnessing a P-38 maintain control through a dive that should have been impossible felt like watching the laws of physics being rewritten. His attempt to intervene by attacking Olds was thwarted when another dive flap-equipped P-38 followed him through his own escape dive. Within minutes, the tactical framework that had governed Luftwaffe operations against P-38s for the past 2 years collapsed. Tony Levier's demonstration flights months earlier had already proven the concept. At the 20th Fighter Group's base at Kings Cliff, he performed a vertical dive from 25,000 feet in a modified P-38 J-25, reaching speeds that would normally cause loss of control or structural failure. Skeptical pilots watched in amazement as Levier pulled out smoothly at 3,000 feet and performed a series of low-level single-engine rolls, demonstrating complete control. Ground crews initially thought they were witnessing a crash, rushing to the wreckage, only to see Levier climb out of his intact fighter with a satisfied grin. The technical intelligence section of the Luftwaffe would not fully grasp the events over Pest until weeks later, when captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed the existence of dive recovery flaps and their transformative effect on P-38 performance. General Adolf Galland, reviewing reports from surviving pilots of the June 10th engagement, initially refused to believe that American engineers had solved the compressibility problem that German scientists had considered fundamental to the P-38's twin-boom design. He insisted that pilots must have misjudged the speeds involved, only when gun camera footage from a damaged Bf 109 returning to base clearly showed a Joe P-38 in controlled pursuit at speeds previously thought impossible. Did German commanders accept that their tactical advantage had disappeared? The modifications at Lockheed's Burbank facility during spring 1944 represented a massive industrial effort. Existing P-38s were retrofitted with dive flaps, while new production aircraft incorporated them from the start, with workers towing completed fighters onto the open ramp for modification. Because the production line could not be halted. The urgency of this work stemmed from reports of mounting losses to German fighters, who were now being pursued without restraint. Kelly Johnson personally supervised round-the-clock teams installing dive flap kits on P-38J models as they rolled off the assembly line. By June 1944, the final 210 P-38J-25 low models featured dive flaps as standard equipment. Although the 14-month delay meant thousands of earlier aircraft still had the original limitations, dive recovery flaps had an impact far beyond simply allowing P-38s to follow diving enemy aircraft. They fundamentally changed the tactical employment of the Lightning. In both offensive and defensive missions, pilots could now initiate their own high-altitude diving attacks, gaining tremendous speed advantages that made them nearly impossible to intercept. Bomber escort missions became far more effective, as P-38s could pursue attacking fighters through any evasive maneuver. Major John Mitchell, who led the mission to intercept Admiral Yamamoto in April 1943, later stated that dive flaps would have transformed that operation, allowing pilots to pursue escaping Japanese aircraft without restriction. The aftermath of the Pest mission on June 10, 1944, sent shockwaves through Luftwaffe fighter commands across the Mediterranean and European theaters. Returning German pilots reported that P-38s could now maintain controlled pursuit through dives exceeding 500 miles per hour, challenging everything they had been taught about American fighter limitations. Oberleutnant Hans Muller, who had barely escaped Captain Old's pursuit by diving through a valley at treetop level, submitted a combat report describing the American Lightning as completely transformed, capable of following any maneuver without signs of control problems. Initially, intelligence officers dismissed the report as pilot error or exaggeration, until similar accounts arrived from dozens of other encounters over Romania. The Japanese Naval Air Force experienced a similar revelation in October 1944. Lieutenant Commander Masaaki Shimakawa of the 265th Kukitai reported encountering P-38s over the Philippines that could now pursue his Mitsubishi A6M0 through vertical dives that had previously guaranteed escape. Shimakawa's after-action report noted that the Lightning maintained pursuit through a 70 dive from 18,000 feet, closing steadily despite the Zero's attempts to escape. He only survived by pulling into a vertical climb at the last moment, using the Zero's superior low-speed maneuverability to reverse the engagement, though he observed that the P-38 pilot had pursued aggressively until fuel limitations forced a break-off. Strategic implications of dive recovery flaps became clear during the large-scale air battles over southern France in August 1944. P-38J-25 LO fighters of the 474th Fighter Group demonstrated their capability by destroying 21 FW-190s in a single engagement on August 25, pursuing fleeing German fighters through dives that would have been suicidal just months earlier. Colonel Clinton Wassam, commanding the 474th, reported that the dive flaps had restored pilots' confidence, transforming them from cautious escorts into aggressive hunters who could follow any enemy fighter through any maneuver. The psychological advantage that the Luftwaffe had enjoyed for 2 years had reversed completely, as German pilots hesitated to engage P-38s, knowing their primary escape tactic was no longer effective. Technical details of how dive recovery flaps solved the compressibility problem remained classified during the war, but captured German documents revealed extensive efforts to understand and potentially replicate the innovation. Professor Willy Messed studied recovered P-38 components and noted in a September 1944 memorandum that the American solution was elegantly simple: controlling transonic airflow while maintaining lift across the wing. Although German industry lacked the resources to implement similar modifications on their fighters, the analysis concluded that the dive flaps created a controlled aerodynamic fence, preventing shock wave formation, a concept that would influence post-war German aircraft design. Lieutenant Colonel Angelo Tundi's experience with the captured Italian P-38G gained new significance in hindsight. His reports on compressibility limitations had helped German pilots develop escape tactics, making the American solution even more devastating to Luftwaffe morale. Tundi, who later flew P-38L models with the post-war Italian Air Force, commented that dive flaps transformed the Lightning from a dangerous aircraft into a complete fighter capable of any maneuver. He speculated that dozens of German pilots who had escaped using dive tactics in 1943 would have been shot down if their opponents had the improved capability. Tundi's combat claim of shooting down a B-24 on August 11, 1943, might never have occurred if the captured P-38 had dive flaps. He could have maintained his initial dive rather than being forced to break off. Production statistics highlight the tragic consequences of the 14-month delay. Only the final 210 P-38J-25 low models received factory-installed flaps. Thousands of earlier aircraft continued operating with the original limitations. The loss of 200 dive flap kits when an RAF fighter mistakenly destroyed the transport carrying them to England in March 1944 represented not just a material loss, but potentially hundreds of Allied pilots who later died because their aircraft could not pursue dive-in enemy fighters. Kelly Johnson later estimated that implementing dive flaps just 6 months earlier could have saved over 300 American aircraft and their crews, while simultaneously increasing the number of German aircraft destroyed in combat. The 15th Air Force's 3 P-38 fighter groups in Italy, the 1st, 14th, and 82nd, saw a dramatic shift in combat effectiveness after receiving dive flap modifications. Kill ratios improved from barely 1-to-1 in early 1944 to nearly 4-to-1 by September, as pilots could now pursue any enemy aircraft, regardless of evasive maneuvers. Major Thomas Maguire, of the 475th Fighter Group in the Pacific, who would become America's second highest scoring ace with 38 victories, credited dive flaps with at least 8 of his kills. He explained that the flaps allowed him to follow Japanese Zeros through extreme dives during the intense air battles over the Philippines. Maguire's P-38L, equipped with factory-installed dive flaps and improved engines, could maintain pursuit through virtually any maneuver the Japanese tried, fundamentally changing Pacific air combat dynamics. The psychological impact of dive recovery flaps went beyond tactics. Allied intelligence deliberately spread information about the modification through German POW camps and neutral countries, ensuring Luftwaffe pilots knew their primary escape tactic was no longer reliable. Leaflets dropped over German airfields mocked the message, "Your dive won't save you anymore," accompanied by technical diagrams showing P-38s pursuing Bf-109s in vertical dives. The campaign proved effective as German pilots increasingly avoided engagements with P-38 formations, with several Luftwaffe units requesting transfers from sectors where these groups operated. The long-term impact of dive recovery flaps extended beyond World War II, influencing early jet fighter designs that faced similar compressibility issues at higher speeds and establishing high-speed flight control principles still relevant today. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt incorporated similar dive flaps after observing the P-38's success, and the North American P-51 Mustang's laminar flow wing design reflected lessons learned from how Lightning flaps managed transonic airflow. Even German jets like the Messerschmitt Me 262 were influenced by captured P-38 data, though they addressed compressibility differently due to higher speeds. By December 1944, the transformation was complete. P-38L models with improved engines and factory-standard dive flaps entered service in both the European and Pacific theaters. These late-model Lightnings bore little resemblance to the compressibility limited aircraft that had struggled over North Africa 2 years earlier. They could reach 440 miles per hour in level flight and maintain controlled dives approaching Mach 0.75 speeds that would have seemed impossible to German pilots who had confidently exploited the P-38's earlier weaknesses. The addition of power-boosted ailerons further enhanced maneuverability, allowing the Lightning to fulfill Kelly Johnson's vision of a high-altitude interceptor capable of all combat maneuvers. The final blow to German doctrine came during Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945, when Luftwaffe fighters attempting a major offensive found that P-38LS could pursue them through escape dives and overtake them using superior altitude and dive flap-assisted pursuit. Oberst Johann Steinhoff, one of Germany's most experienced fighter commanders with 176 victories, survived an encounter with dive flap-equipped P-38s over Belgium. He later wrote that seeing Lightnings maintain formation while diving at speeds that should have destroyed them convinced him the war was truly lost, demonstrating American technical superiority. Even his Me 262 jet, capable of outrunning any Allied piston fighter in level flight, could not escape a diving P-38L. Using altitude and dive flap tactics, German pilot losses increased sharply after June 1944, as they instinctively reverted to dive tactics that had saved them in the past. Replacement pilots trained under outdated doctrine were especially vulnerable, lacking the experience to recognize modified lightnings and adapt their tactics. Luftwaffe training manuals attempted updates, but the pace of American modifications and German communication breakdowns meant many pilots faced P-38 LS. Without prior warning, the story of dive recovery flaps highlights a triumph of engineering persistence over a seemingly insurmountable problem. Kelly Johnson's team at Lockheed, under extreme pressure and limited resources, developed a solution that solved the immediate problem and advanced high-speed aerodynamics, knowledge that would prove vital in the jet age. The 14-month delay in implementing the solution cost hundreds of Allied lives and allowed thousands of German pilots to escape. But once deployed, dive flaps transformed the P-38 from a limited escort fighter into a versatile combat aircraft that helped establish Allied air superiority over Europe and the Pacific. Final production statistics illustrate the transformation. The last 3,923 P-38L models incorporated lessons from 3 years of combat, including dive recovery flaps, boosted ailerons, improved cockpit heating, and engines producing 1,600 horsepower with emergency boost. These aircraft bore almost no resemblance to the early P-38E models encountered over North Africa in 1942. German pilots who once dismissed the P-38 as an easy target now faced a modern fighter that could match or exceed their own aircraft in nearly every performance metric. The legacy of dive flaps extended into the post-war era, captured German scientists and engineers working with Allied aviation companies incorporated lessons from the P-38 into early jet fighters. The Soviet Union, having obtained extensive technical data, developed its own solutions to transonic flight influenced by American dive flap technology. Even modern fighters use computerized flight control systems performing the same function as the P-38's simple electrical dive flaps, managing airflow to maintain control at transonic and supersonic speeds. While the human cost of the dive flap delay can never be fully calculated, pilot confidence and combat effectiveness improved dramatically after their installation. Captain William Capron of the 474th Fighter Group, who had experienced control loss due to compressibility in early 1944, wrote that flying a dive flap-equipped P-38J felt like being released from invisible chains, allowing him to fight aggressively in situations that had previously meant certain death. The psychological effect on German pilots was equally significant. Many veterans reported that losing their diving escape tactic fundamentally changed how they approached combat. They were forced to rely on aircraft performance and personal skill rather than exploiting a known flaw in the enemy fighter. Moment Oberleutnant Hans Muller realized his dive escape had failed and that Captain Robins' P-38 was still pursuing him at 500 miles per hour represented more than a tactical setback. It marked the end of an era in which technical limitations could be exploited to overcome numerical and material disadvantages. The dive recovery flaps, which prevented the P-38 from being considered a failure, instead elevated it to legendary status. They created a fighter capable of fulfilling its original design goal: long-range, high-altitude superiority. German pilots who had once mocked the fork-tailed Lightning's inability to follow a dive discovered too late that American engineering had turned their former advantage into a deadly trap. Diving away from a P-38 equipped with these flaps no longer ensured escape. It merely gave the American pilot a decisive speed advantage, making evasion impossible.